I'm a Beverly girl, but I was not born in Beverly Farms. I grew up in wonderful North Beverly. I moved to Beverly Farms after I was married and fell in love with the place. It really is still, not so much, but it was a village within the city and had a very different development from the rest of Beverly. I've given a lot of talks about Beverly Farms history over the years, and I'm in the process, which I hope I finish before I die, of writing a book about the history of the ordinary people of Beverly Farms, the year-round population. And that's been my focus. Some of you may have read the books written by Joe Garland about the wealthy families in Beverly on the North Shore. And a lot has been done with that history. So I started the Beverly Farms History Project to collect stories and pictures of the ordinary people. So this is one of a series of lectures about the ordinary people of Beverly Farms. So let's start. And I apologize for not being here last time. If you came looking for me a month ago, I had fallen flat on my face and broke my nose and my lip, and I really looked a treat. And I couldn't have talked. So here I am. I'm all healed. Okay. Let me ask a couple of questions. How many of you are roughly familiar with the Beverly Farms area? Okay, most of you. And is there anybody here whose somebody in your family worked on the estates or worked in Beverly Farms? Yes, where?
My grandfather was a retired cop, and he worked for a time for Eleanor Sears as what they called a night watchman in those days.
Oh, okay. Yeah, she was quite a girl. Okay, my title is Beverly Farms Gardens and Gardeners from the 1840s to the 1950s. And prior to the 1840s, I've got to get used to my pointer. Prior to the 1840s, Beverly Farms was really an isolated district. The road from Beverly Farms to downtown Beverly, as Robert Rantoul described it as a hard road, but meaning it was hard gravel, but still difficult to negotiate, particularly during the winter. So until the train came through, Beverly Farms was pretty isolated. People there had either been working in the maritime trade or as farmers. And when the train came through, when the Eastern Railroad decided to run a train to Gloucester, they went through Beverly Farms. And as soon as the Eastern Railroad decided to do that, rich people from Boston, several of them members of the board of the Eastern Railroad, bought land along the water. And the first houses began to be built. The earliest people who came, for the most part, were not building fancy gardens. They came to be in nature. There was one exception, which you'll see in a minute. Charles Greeley Loring was one of the first. Payne had bought land, but Charles Greeley Loring was built the first house. And you can see it's a substantial house, but it's not a mansion. And the grounds were, pleasant, but nothing fancy. Franklin Dexter was a little different. These were both Boston lawyers. Franklin Dexter's wife had been to England, and she had pretensions. And so he built a little mansion in the 1840s. And I like the story. The land was owned by Sam Ober, and it was so rough he couldn't farm it. He had picked up small pieces of land, so he raised sheep. And the location of this property is, if you're coming from Beverly, going to Beverly Farms, right after Prince Street on the ocean side, there's a kind of fancy entrance with, I don't know, not pillars, but stanchions of some kind on the edge of the driveway. That's Oberland, which is what Dexter chose to call his property. When he tried to buy it, Sam Ober, who was a very honest Yankee, went to William Endicott, who had a lot of weight in the community as a sober man, and said, "There's a man from Boston wants to buy my property for $2,000. 'Tain't worth it. What should I do?" and Endicott said, you should sell it. And he said, "But it ain't worth it." And he said, "If there's a man from Boston who wants to throw his money away buying your property, take it." So he did. And then Sam Ober stayed on as his caretaker. And Mrs. Dexter had been to England, and she'd seen these beautiful rolled green lawns at mansions in England, and she wanted one. So she called Sam Ober out as the caretaker and said she wanted a mown lawn. And this is before lawnmowers. And he looks at her and said, "Well, if your maid will come out and hold up the grass, I'll get a pair of scissors." A man with a sense of humor. This is the earliest garden picture I have, and it's not very satisfactory. But this was part of the Loring garden, and it was more a vegetable garden. It wasn't a fancy flower garden. In 1865, Charles Greeley Loring hired Stephen Conley to be his gardener. Stephen Conley was an Irish immigrant who had come, his brother had come to the United States and worked on the Lyman estate in Waltham. And he was apparently educated because he acted as a tutor for the Lyman kids. Stephen was, I think, illiterate, but he was a younger brother. He came, started working on the Lyman estate, and Charles Greeley Loring hired him away and brought him to Beverly Farms. He's the father of the Conley brothers, who founded Conley Brothers Construction Company. And this is the small house that he lived in. He sold land, or gave land next door to his son, Caleb William Loring. And that, you can see this is woodland. They're not planting big gardens. But Caleb Loring was interested in gardens. This is his property. You can see, beautiful view, but mostly treed. But he did have a garden. And this is, did anybody figure out what is going on here? Seaweed. Yeah, collecting seaweed as fertilizer for the garden. And this was from the Loring collection. Oh, sorry. Boy, that went fast. Caleb William was very interested in agriculture. And he and Henry Lee, who had a house on the beach, were the first people to bring rhododendrons to America. So he kept a garden journal, and you can see phlox, honeysuckle, rhododendron at the top. He ordered most of his seed and any plants from England.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you turn me up?
I have pretty high, but
I'll try to speak louder. Yeah, I can do it. So he kept close watch of his garden, and the next photograph is his daughters in his garden. And I love it. It looks like a Sargent painting. His two daughters are Catherine and Louisa. Catherine is another story. Is this the Loring Room, or is that in Beverly Farms? Yeah. She was very active in libraries. Anyway, it's a great picture, and you can see it's just a normal, beautiful, small garden. This is the Franklin Haven estate. This was another one of the early estates. It was on the beach. It's not there anymore. You can see by looking at it, it's a house that grew over the years. And its gardener was actually more a farmer. And this was Daniel Murray, who came from Ireland. And you can see him with his team of oxen. Again, there was small plantings around the house, but it wasn't no big elaborate gardens. In 1887, Beverly Farms tried to secede from Beverly, and this is just the map of the farms at that time. At that time, the reason I show it to you is people who were year-round residents signed a petition to separate from Beverly. It was the wealthy people who wanted it for tax reasons. But they talked, the local people had always felt like Beverly sort of ignored them. So they were willing. And of the people who signed, there were these gardeners. And certainly they didn't have a vested interest in leaving Beverly, but their employers did. So they signed it. So you can see they're mostly foreign-born. James Dow, I don't know if all of these were, but Durkin, Cosgrove, Dow. Stephen Conley was always listed as a farmer, but he was certainly a gardener too. By the 1890s, Beverly Farms starts to become the Gold Coast. The first big estate that was built for a man named Kidder, and he died very shortly after. And I forgot how to. This house became the home of. Just lost it, old age. Washington B. Thomas, who was a sugar, in sugar manufacturing. And that was one of the first big ones. That was in the 1890s. And then this is the Eyre Estate, which also is no longer there, that was in Pride's Crossing on some of the Endicott property, waterfront property. Swiftmore was the biggest estate that got built, and that was built around 1902, I think, 1902 or 3. And it was Swift Meat Company, one of the brothers. And you can see here, at this point, you don't see much garden, but more garden was built. And this is the Leiter Estate, also on the beach. This is the only one that's still standing of the big estates on the beach, of the largest estates. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. In 1899, the professional gardeners, now there were most of the big estates, as they hired gardeners from Europe, mostly from England, but England, Scotland, Ireland, and a few from Sweden. People who had been trained in their own country as estate gardeners. And in 1899, a group of professional gardeners in Manchester started the North Shore Horticultural Society. And at first it was just for Manchester gardeners. And then in 1900, a group of Beverly Farms people joined their meetings. They met twice a month, and it was a place for them to share knowledge. So someone might have been trained as a greenhouse man, and he might give a talk about raising certain things. In 1899, a lot of Beverly Farms gardeners joined. Peter Donovan, and then the Conley brothers, Stephen's children, were not gardeners. They did, at that time, mostly landscape work in terms of bringing in fill, taking out trees, but they joined the Horticultural Society to be part of the crowd. Same with Daniel Linehan. The Linehans were builders, not really gardeners. William Moriarty was a gardener. And then the rest are from Beverly, Patrick Ahern. So it became really a good social club for these people, as well as an exchange of information. Some of you may have known wonderful Ed Brown, who was a Beverly historian and a Beverly Farms historian. Ed's grandfather was Thomas Jack, his mother's father. Thomas Jack was a professional gardener, and from Ed, I have this letter. So this is from Scotland. This will certify that Thomas Jack served here as a journeyman for the last 3 years. And, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is the second letter. During the past 12 months, he has had charge of the fruit plant houses and has given me entire satisfaction. I have always found him strictly sober, honest, industrious, and most attentive to his duties. I have no hesitation in recommending him to any party requiring the services of something and good. What is it?
Thorough.
Oh yeah, a thorough good man. And that's Andrew Patterson, the gardener to Sir Robert Dundee. He went from Scotland to Manchester and worked at Highwood, which was one of the Manchester estates, the Walker estate. And it says, this is to certify that Thomas Jack has been in my employ as a gardener since the winter of 1903, being promoted shortly after that from second to first position. He's a competent gardener and thoroughly sober, honest, and trustworthy. He left my service for no fault, and I shall be very glad to speak or write to anyone in his favor. Yours truly, William Walker. He got a job working for the Curtis estate, which is one of the estates, oh, sorry. One of the estates that's still there. It's a condominiums on Hale Street, on the corner of Hale and Beach Streets, and, Hale and Oak Street. So you can still see that. I'll talk a little more about Thomas Jack later. Right. The most interesting garden that was built during the very beginning of the 20th century, was built by John and William Spalding. And these are two very interesting men, brothers. If you go to the Museum of Fine Arts, a lot of the Impressionist paintings were part of the Spalding collection. And a little more about their art later. They had a beautiful house on the water. This is Sunset Rock, which has been, the top story was taken off. So it's a smaller house now, but it's still there, overlooking the ocean in Beverly Farms off Payne Avenue. Their sister lived and her husband lived in an estate mansion next door to them. They had a small garden here, but they lived with their aged mother, and they decided they would build a garden for her where they could take her to enjoy the garden. So they bought land on Greenwood Avenue, corner of down on Greenwood Avenue. And this is it's the property where the Glen Urquhart School is now. And it was farm property. They purchased it, I think, from the Larkham family. Yeah. It was good tillage land. There's not too much good tillage land in Beverly Farms, and this was some of it. Fairly flat, well watered. And between 1907 and 1908, they created a garden that included pools, terraces, balustrades, temple front follies, Japanese bridge, massive trellises and pergolas, and then also vegetable gardens, a large greenhouse, a fruit greenhouse, so on. It was a fabulous garden. And it was designed by Little and Brown, who were architects and landscape architects working during this period, who favored more formal European-style gardens. Construction work was probably done by Linehan and Company because they had done work at Sunset Rock, and probably an Italian work crew. At this time, there were 2 Italian shanty towns in Beverly Farms right near there, where Italian workers for Conley and Linehan lived. And so they both used Italian laborers in their work. The layout of the garden and the planting were done by a gardener named Frank Cole, who was from England. And the rose garden and design and plants were provided by a minister's wife from Marblehead, Harriet Risley Foote, who was a rose expert. I love this picture. This was the rose arbor. And the ruin, and you can see greenhouses in the background, because in addition to a beautiful flower garden, there were greenhouses for fruit and probably for starting vegetables and maybe for starting plants. So that it was just a gorgeous place. In 1909, there was some kind of labor problem. I don't know what it was. But we know from that there were at least 6 workers plus a foreman, but probably more than that. The 6 got fired, and as did the foreman. The first person the person who was the catalyst of my working on the Beverly Farms History Project is this man, Frank Albano. He was my neighbor. I had done an exhibit on Italians at the Beverly Historical Society, and through that, I really got to know this neighbor and discovered that he had come here as a teenager and that he'd worked at the Spalding Gardens. And he showed me things I would never have seen without him, the location of the shantytown and other things. So Frank was a kid in Italy. His father was an orphan. They had no land. Frank was illiterate. At age 8, he was beginning to help support the family by trapping eels to sell them. He lived in Fundi, outside of Naples. So he was a poor kid. His brother had come to this country. So at, I think, age 13, Frank left Italy and came, probably with other people from his area, and came to Beverly Farms, where his brother was working for Linehan and living in Linehan's shantytown. Frank went there, and his brother tried to get him a job with Linehan, and there had been child labor laws passed, and Linehan wouldn't hire him. He was too young. So his brother left Linehan, got a job with Spalding and took his little brother along with him. So from the time he was 13, Frank was working at Spalding Gardens. And so he's the only person who was actually an estate gardener. No, he and his son are the only people I've interviewed who are actually estate gardeners. Most of my information comes from the families of estate gardeners. Frank loved describing his jobs. He said, lots of people, lots. I said, how many gardeners? Lots of people, lots of people. Mostly English. Oh, those English. They'd sit and drink beer and make me do all the work. But he worked in the fruit greenhouses, and can you imagine, this was one of his jobs. He would climb up to the grapevines and cut grapes from the bunches so that the grapes would grow bigger. And that was one of his jobs. He also worked with the man who took care of the roses. The Spalding Gardens were, I'll talk about this guy first. Joseph Tilson was one of the gardeners, and his specialty was fruit. He'd come from England and was a member of North Shore Horticultural Society from 1911 on. In 1914, it shows him presenting a very valuable paper on fruit growing. So he was a very skilled gardener who was able to teach others. And then in 1915, the garden's gone. Everything's over. A garden haunted by memories of the past, memories of the time when it was sought by crowds of pleasure seekers and flower friends from all parts of the country, cannot, in a way, be a very cheerful place to visit. But such a garden exists in the Beverly Farms, and newcomers to the shore could see no more beautiful spot than these deserted gardens present. One lone gardener is in charge now, where once a large force was actively engaged. During its heyday, the garden was open every Sunday. And Frank said, "Oh, you had to keep it neat as a pin, neat as a pin." And so that was, again, one of his jobs. As I said in the beginning, the Spalding brothers were very interested in art. And they had bought Impressionists and American painters of their period. But then they traveled to Japan and became fascinated by Japanese prints. And I think their mother had died by now. And they completely devoted themselves to purchasing prints. So the Museum of Fine Arts has one of the finest collections of Japanese prints from the Spalding brothers. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the people who purchased Japanese prints for them. Oh, I have a heavy finger. Boy, that went fast. All right. Frank Cole, who had been the manager, left and formed North Shore Nurseries, which was farther down the street. This picture is a later picture. Albert Burridge purchased the gardens, and he was an orchid fancier. And until he died, it became Orchid Vale, the Burridge Gardens. And I'll talk more about that later. But this is actually a later picture where there were very many greenhouses. All right, in 1903, Henry Frick built a house with over 100 rooms, bigger than the White House. Conley Brothers and would be bringing, I can't remember how many train loads of dirt was brought from Peabody, I think, to level out and fill craggy areas on the property. Eagle Rock is was at the top. Do you all know where the big iron fence is in Beverly Farms? That was the Frick estate. And the house was on the ocean side. The house is no longer there. There is a house there that you'll see if you're driving to Beverly Farms. You'll see a fairly substantial brick building on the driveway, on the hill. That was the car house. And it was for the cars, the chauffeurs, and also had an electric plant in it. But the big house is gone. The original plans for the garden at Eagle Rock was designed by Little and Brown, and this is the same kind of very fancy French garden, maybe. And Henry Frick would have none of it. He wasn't interested in that kind of stuff. He wanted it just natural around his house. So that was never built. But there were beautiful areas coming in, beautiful big driveway, lovely pergola, lovely trellises with roses. And across the street, Frederick Law Olmsted designed Frick's Gardens that were on this side. Do you all recognize the building up on the top? Those were Frick's stables. And this house down below was, I think that was the gardener's house. There are a couple of different ones. But you can see here you've got more just fairly formal gardens, but not fussy. This is, I got information from the Frick library. Just to give you a little idea, George Winus, who was the main gardener, made $120 a month. Now that doesn't, it was far more than that in today's money. That was a very substantial wage. James Cruikshank, who was one of the gardeners, $75. Then Cameron, $60. So they're getting paid, all of them are getting paid more than indoor servants were getting paid. Maids, footmen weren't paid as much. A butler might be paid as much as the gardener. Got butler and a chef. But the gardeners were well paid, and the head gardeners got housing. The other gardeners didn't. And Frick was very close with his money. 1907. Sir, I observe that you spent over and above your regular payroll for the month of October, $214.20. I cannot understand what these men have been doing, nor the necessity for this expense. Now that's November. Okay, and then over here, I do not wish you to order anything hereafter costing over $25 unless you have permission in writing from me. I will instruct Mr. McElroy to prepare a blank order which you can fill in from time to time and get my approval. I see you have been buying hay recently from Linehan. It seems to me that it is entirely unnecessary, and I want you to explain it to me. So you can never get the idea that Frick paid his gardeners more than anybody else. He didn't. He was a Scotsman. In the beginning of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1902, the two biggest estates on the beach were built. The first was Swiftmore, which you saw a picture of before, and it's gigantic. And below is Rock Marge. Swiftmore was owned by one of the, not Gustav Swift, but his brother. And Rock Marge was built by a man named William Moore, who was known as Judge Moore. He was never a judge. He was a good judge of the art of the deal. He owned Nabisco, he owned shares in the Rock Island Railroad, and the joke was that I think Rock Marge was so named for being paid for by things sold on the margin of the Rock Island Railroad. I don't know. But he was a very cagey New York businessman and had a mansion in New York. His wife, whose first name escapes me for the moment, but it doesn't matter, was an art lover. She was an extremely generous woman, and outlived him by quite a bit. And she was the gardener, the one who was interested in having gardens. Now, how many of you have ever walked the length of West Beach? Okay, if you've walked the length, you've seen two little bathhouses. Those bathhouses belonged to Rock Marge and Swiftmore. You can see them down here. Where am I? Here. The one with the dome was Rock Marge. And you see here is, Judge Moore was interested in horses. That was the other thing he was a judge of, horse flesh. I think that he refurbished this house from somebody else's and built this carriage house and stable, which I think cost more than the house. Now here you see the bathhouses, and you see all of this lawn going down to the beach. When they bought the properties, all of this was salt marsh. So that was all filled land. When the perfect storm came through and tore out seawall, that filled up with water again. But there's a pumping system under that to constantly pump when needed. So this was all filled land. And the gardens, for the most part, were closer to the house. But you can see there's an alley of trees. This is Ada Small Moore, Mrs. Moore. I wish I'd known her. And this is Warren Manning, who did the landscape design and the filling of the marsh. If you've ever walked the beach, you might see this manhole cover, and that's part of the pumping system.
Does it still work?
I think so. I forget the name of the woman. Pansy Haley, her husband, I think, used to take charge of the pumping. I don't know what the situation is now, but that land would flood at very high tides. All right, I love this. This is a picture of Linehan's doing landscape work by building a wall between, and they are down on that filled land now. And you can see the beach houses in the distance up here. So the ocean is here. I think that might be Old Man Linehan. And the teams of horses, I don't know what they're doing. Mrs. Moore would have a walkthrough of her garden. And she very often, for charitable purposes, would open her garden for Boy Scouts or for war effort. She built, in order to go to the beach without getting hot, there was an alley of trees built or planted. And these were the formal gardens that were around the house. Very beautiful. A rock garden, water garden, grotto. And then she was, I think, one of the first to have big commercial greenhouses. There had been greenhouses before, but look, this was her Lord and Burnham greenhouse in 1905, and then the addition with a white garden. And these are all up high nearer the house. Mary Leiter built Edgewater House in 1910. She was a widow of a Chicago merchant. She died that summer, and her son and his wife chartered a yacht for a year to take a long cruise. And their English gardener, William Swan, quit right in the middle of the summer. Joseph Tyson, you'll remember from being the fruit gardener at Spalding's Gardens. No, wait a minute. Am I right? Yeah, left Spalding and took the job. And the job at Edgewater came with this beautiful house. The house is the gardener's house. The rest of it is garages and stable workers up above it. Hang on, I want to get one thing I didn't get to read. Here it is. I feel old. So you can see some formal layout of the garden around the house itself, and then the whole layout. So here's the gardener's cottage, and then back toward where 45 West Street is, were the greenhouses. So this was a big spread, and none of this flooded. Oops. So Joseph Tyson went and took over the job, and this appeared in North Shore Breeze magazine is one of the magazines, one of the resources that I used a lot for the research. It's all, the full run of it is only available at the Phillips Library, which I think is now in Rowley, of the Peabody Essex. It was the magazine of the summer people. It was the magazine of the summer people. It had articles about social activities, gardens, and also articles about just each of the communities themselves. So it wasn't just a summer people's magazine, but it carried a lot of information. This is a description of Edgewater House greenhouses. The estate has immense hothouses in which an English plan is in operation for raising fruits and vegetables. The Leiter family has been supplied all spring by the products of their greenhouse in Beverly Farms. They lived in Washington, D.C., so they sent the food, I guess. The English gardener, Joseph Tilson, has been experimenting in many unique ways. Luscious figs, nectarines, peaches, tree tomatoes, and melons are among some of the special novelties seen in the hotbeds. The melons are especially attractive, growing on small vines running up the side walls. And each melon is so heavy 2 to 4 pounds, that it's encased in a little nest tied to the ceiling. The peach and nectarine trees are trained fan-shaped on netting and make a very ornamental sight. The visitor would think it was all arranged for an artistic fruit show, but the gardener assures one that it is all for a very utilitarian purpose. He has rooms of various temperatures, some extremely hot, in which fruit is forced, and others cooler, in which the fruit will mature later. In this way, he hopes to extend the crop as long as the family remains in Beverly Farms. Various small garden supplies, I don't think he means supplies, were raised in the hothouses and sent to the lighters in Washington all winter. So it was a classy place. And Tilson got to live in that lovely house. When Joseph Leiter returned in the middle of the summer, Joseph Tyson quit and moved out. I'm not sure why. I guess he didn't like Joseph Leiter. And a Welshman named Percy Huxley took over. Huxley had immigrated in 1911 and took over as head gardener. Okay. When the war in Europe came in 1915, a lot of the Italian workers in Beverly Farms and elsewhere went back to Italy to fight in the war. Frank Albano, who had been the young boy at Spalding Gardens, was one of those who went to fight the war. And this is Frank with his hand up. This meant that contractors had difficulty finding people. And I lost myself a little bit there. On the eve of the war, there were 95 gardeners living or working in Beverly Farms and Pride's Crossing. The largest, 42 in all, were Irish. The largest estates tended to have head gardeners from England, Scotland, Wales, and a few from Sweden. Most of the rest were native born. Jack Ciro was the only Italian listed as a gardener, though Giuseppe D'Alesso and Giraldo and Luigi De Fazio were listed as laborers. So when World War I began, there were really not Italian gardeners. When I first moved to Beverly Farms, people would say, who didn't really know, would say, oh yeah, the Italians worked outside and the Irish worked inside. Well, depended on what you were talking about, when you were talking about. In 1907, as reported by North Shore Breeze, Governor and President asked North Shore estate owners to plant all their land in vegetables. North Shore Breeze ran an article on how to put in vegetable gardens. Beverly insurance agencies advertised war insurance. The Italians along the North Shore proved themselves to be a loyal group of young men and were ready to register on Tuesday with good spirit. These were people who hadn't already gone to fight for Italy. Open garden tours of Pride's estates, Swift, Moore, Thomas Hutchinson, Spalding, Bradley, and Dexter. 50 cents admission, Boy Scout guides. This is for the war, to benefit the Red Cross. Yeah?
What is war insurance?
I don't know. I can't imagine anybody wanting to sell it. Okay, after the war, this man, Alfred Rogers, became the head gardener for Mrs. Moore and remained that gardener until he died. He was an excellent gardener. And some of you may be familiar with this building on Hale Street, just after you cross the railroads in Pride's Crossing. That was built by Mrs. Moore for her head gardener, her chauffeur, and I think a couple of other people who worked on the estate. So that was estate housing. She had several undergardeners, James Cruikshank, Alfred Smith, and then 2 greenhouse men, John Del Mastro and Joe Boscia. Hostler gardener was James Barry. And Arcangelo Fiore was a laborer. This is James Barry, whose wife said he used to sing to his horses and was just a lovely, humorous man and loved working for Mrs. Moore. He did well. He was able to buy a house on Pickett Court. Joe Boscia's was a greenhouse man. I think I have a picture of him there. Oh, yeah, here's Joe Boscia in the greenhouse. Mrs. Moore bought this house for him. A little house on Conley Place. This is one of my favorite gardeners. Austin Lydon, who was an Irishman, was, I think, sort of a breadwinner in his family in Ireland. His father had died, and yeah.
Was the Moore Estate where the AMC is now?
No.
Where was the Moore Estate?
The Moore Estate was right on the beach. When AMC, what, I don't even know what that is.
AMG, like given that that's where
that
the
was
car.
low.
That was
Pardon?
what?
The Loeb Estate.
Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, that was the Loeb Estate. No, it was on the water. You have to walk down the beach to see where it was. They were right on the far end of West Beach.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Austin Lydon was 14 years old when he started working as a laborer, and his first job in the United States, he came to live with cousins or relatives in Boston, and was working building the subway. So he was doing, hard work. He and his wife came to Beverly Farms in 1919. I think it was his wife's sister was working for the Havens, and she and her husband decided to go back to Ireland to visit, and wanted Austin and his wife, Delia, to come and take their place at the Haven Estate. They never came back. So Austin Lydon became a gardener for the Haven Estate. And this man below was the farmer gardener. And that was Daniel Murray, who's, some of you may have known Faith McLaughlin or Eleanor Lawler. That's their grandfather. Or their father, yeah. The Haven Estate, as I said, no longer exists, but it would have been about 4 houses down on the beach. There are newer houses in that property now. This was one of the beautiful gardens in Beverly Farms, and Austin Lydon became the caretaker for the second owner. The garden was developed by Charles Greeley Loring Jr., who was he was an artist, fine arts person, had been a see, general in the Civil War. And Leiden didn't work for him, but by 1920s, it was owned by Quincy Shaw. The estate was owned by Quincy Shaw. And Austin Leiden moved to this estate and worked for Shaw. And here was the gardener's cottage. And you can see you can see this greenhouse from it's part of Landmark now, that property. So it was a beautiful place. It was a beautiful place, but Austin Leiden didn't love living that close to Mrs. Shaw. She would send somebody down to get him in the middle of dinner and say she wanted him to do something. And he didn't think that was terrific. So as soon as he had enough money, he bought this house on the other side of a mile away. So he had a little commute. He didn't get a free house, but he didn't have Mrs. Shaw on his back all the time. This is in the early 20s, the Italian laborers returned to the labor market. So they'd gone back to Italy, and then there was the war ended. There was the period of the influenza. Many of them had stayed in Italy for a while and gotten married, and began coming back during the 20s. And this is Peter Cacciola, who, I just love that picture of him, came back, among others. Frank Albano also came back. Not all did, but most did. The labor problem on the North Shore is acute, especially in the care of grounds of the estates. Laboring men that were available in pre-war days for $1.50 a day, the Italians are now demanding wages incommensurate with their responsibilities and duties. So since most of them worked 6 days a week, the highest amount of pay they could have gotten would have been $40. Now in 1915, $40 would equal $12.50. So it's not as low as it looked like. But if it had been unchanged, they would have been making $650. Frank Albano, who had, after Spalding Gardens were sold to Burridge, Burridge had hired Frank to work for him. So he had continued working for Burridge, I think not with orchids, but with the vegetable gardens and the vegetable greenhouses or fruit greenhouses. Antonio Ray, who had worked for Conley Brothers, returned and worked for Conley again. Stephen Spiridigliosi, who had gone back and forth several times, brought his wife, got a job as a gardener in Manchester. There still weren't any Italians working as head gardeners. Of the 118 gardeners living and working for Beverly Farms, only 14 were Italian. You can see some of the Italians. I realize I'm running very late. You can see there are a few Italians here working for Eagle Rock in 1922. The head gardener's getting $100 a month. Okay. I love this story of poor Percy Huxley. He came to work for Joe Leiter. After Joseph Tilson had left, Joe Leiter was rum running. And it ended up there was a big story about this when somebody came and stole his liquor. Anyway, Percy Huxley was accused of helping with this. And Joe Leiter got off lightly, and I don't know what happened with Huxley, but he left Joe Leiter. He was having no more to do with that and returned to England. During the Depression, the daughter of the Swifts got divorced from her husband. She had inherited the property. She couldn't keep up the payments. It went into foreclosure, and Ada Small Moore bought Swiftmore, so that then her husband was dead. So now there was this huge estate. Swiftmore was torn down. Conley Brothers, so this big estate, Swiftmore, was demolished in 1932. Conley Brothers did the work. She built a lovely little tea house, which is still there, and was Richard Thorndike's house. I think his widow still lives there. Built a new alley and created bigger gardens. In 1937, the number of gardeners living and working in Beverly Farms had fallen to 95, and a larger percentage were now Italian. Paolo Ambrifi to Dr. Fabian, which was off Webster Avenue. Frank Albano was still a gardener for Albert Burge. Joe Boscher was the greenhouse gardener for Mrs. Moore. Louis Campanola for Thomas Barber, and the Carbonis for Mrs. Agassi, who lived the property that's now Thistlewood, or Mistlewood was the Agassi property. So there were many people, many Italians at this time doing gardening work. Steve Sirabigliosi and Anthony Ray both made enough money in the 20s to be able to build houses for themselves. Stephen Spiridigliosi combined his gardening skills with his winemaking skills, and he had been bootlegging, what's the word? Bootlegging. And the chief of police in Beverly was, I think, probably one of his customers. And he was also an architect. And he designed the house for Steve Spiridigliosi. And so this house with the red shutters, which is on, I think it's still Hart, near me, was built. And then his friend, Anthony Ray, asked if he could use the plans. And he said, yes, but you can't build the gambrel roof that I have. So he used the plans and built one back to back with his friend. And here's Tony Ray with his wife in their garden on High Street. And that's Spiridigliosi behind him. Andy McGann became the head gardener of Robert Bradley in 1937. Andy McGann had no training as a gardener. The first gardener on the Bradley estate, who lived in this lovely little house, which is now the Johnson, much bigger. The first gardener for Bradley was William Canning, who you see in the greenhouse below. When Canning left to form a landscaping business of his own, Andy McGann, who had been an undergardener or worked with him, but had never had big garden training, became the gardener. And for a while lived in the house, but his wife didn't want to stay there because they'd built a house on Webster Street Avenue. And she liked it there better. In the 20s, in 1921, the Horticultural Society started something called the Sandy Bay Gardener Prize. And you'll notice that in 1922, the prize was won by William Canning. If you go down to and Alfred Rogers, Mrs. Moore's gardener, got it a couple of times. Bannister must have been Manchester. But Louis Campanola was the first Italian to get it. in 1936. And then Andy McGann got it for 4 years. And he had, as I said, was trained on the job with canning. John Truesdale was the gardener for the famous Countess Guanabasi. And you'll notice that by 1954, the Countess wanted her name up with him. She never laid a hand in the garden. So her name gets followed several times after. That plaque now hangs in the Manchester Historical Society. Peter Cacciola, Italian who'd come back and worked, got mad at his employer during the Depression and left and moved to New York, where his relatives lived. They hated it in New York. So he'd made a terrible mistake. He came back, and eventually things were all well. He he worked in Hamilton for a while, eventually moved back to Beverly Farms, became the president of the Horticultural Society, and had this beautiful garden of his own. And I think the garden below is the garden that he kept. He became the gardener at the Endicott Estate, which is an Audubon place right over the border when you go into Wenham. He was gardener there when he was president of the Horticultural Society. This is my favorite picture. These are Louis Campanolo and Joseph DeFazio. Joseph DeFazio on this side, Louis. I think I get them mixed up. Anyway, they worked for. His name was Barber, I forget his first name, up on West Beach Hill. And every year they would take put together this fabulous array of vegetables for the Massachusetts Horticultural Society's flower show. There must have been a fall show at that time. But it's incredible. I love it. You can take it and pick it apart and see all the different vegetables and the design. The daughter of Louis Campanolo remembered going with her father to watch him put this thing together. After World War II, very few gardeners' children followed in their footsteps. Fewer estates maintained full-time gardeners. And the big estates were pretty much beginning to die out then. Swiftmore had already been torn down. Helen Frick was still coming to Eagle Rock, but she only came once in a while in the summer. The houses weren't really built as year-round houses, so many eventually were torn down. There are very few of them left on the beach. Social Security was established in 1935, but it didn't cover domestic workers or agricultural workers. This was especially hard on people of color around the country. But it was also a problem for people who were estate gardeners. They were at the mercy of their employers, whether they got something or not. Ed Brown's grandfather, Thomas Jack, had been given a mortgage on his property, his house, by his employer, Mrs. Curtis, and she wouldn't let him pay it back. He tried to pay it back and she wouldn't let him. So when he died, he got the house, but he had no pension and ended up having to work. He worked part-time in the library, as a matter of fact. But contracting with Conley Brothers or with other gardening services was just a lot easier. And just the days of the Gold Coast were pretty much done by the mid-50s. One gardener who continued was Frank Albano's son, Emilio. These are pictures of Frank. This is Emilio. They were both lifetime members of Horticultural Society. After World War I, Frank worked with Burridge, and then from 1945 to 1955, he was the head gardener for Mrs. Houghton. And Mrs. Houghton's estate is the estate that became the Loeb estate and is now AMG. At the end of Frank's life, and that's when I met him, he was a part-time gardener for a couple of people, one of them being Kay Whittier. This is, I don't know if you folks remember this house that used to be on the corner. I had a garden at that house with Kay, and Frank was there. And in his 90s, he was still working, and if the person who was supposed to come and pick him up to take him to the garden didn't get there on time, he scolded them. He was, but he was a wonderful guy. And Emilio continued in his footsteps. And he started gardening when he was in 8th grade. They gave the kids a book on gardening. He became the gardener for Mrs. Merrill Hastings. The Hastings house was given in memory of her husband when he died. Then he went on to be the superintendent and gardener at Avalon for the Merrills. Then for Lynn Warren and her husband, and the Gredas who lived nearby. So he was the last of the old estate gardeners to still be an active member of the North Shore Horticultural Society, which he was until he died. So this is Avalon. These are the gardens that Emilio had at her estate. And I think that's it. Okay. Sorry, that was a little long. Does anybody have questions? Yes.
When you described the Frick estate,
Yeah.
the main building is gone.
Yeah.
The carport is still available?
The car building is still there.
Okay.
But it's,
So is that-
it's on the ocean side.
Oh, it's on, so is it on the ocean side as you're going north
Well,
on 127 Hale Street?
yeah,
It's on the ocean side?
Yeah.
So when you go past where all the granite pillars are with the railing across,
Yeah.
on the left-hand side, as you're going north towards Manchester, there's still a big building up there.
yes, that's the stables.
That's the stables. Oh, okay, so
Yeah.
the stables
The
is up on the left-hand side, right next to Landmark. There's a sign there for Landmark School right after that, as you're going south.
Yeah,
The stables, and then there's a
is,
Landmark School.
I can't remember if it's right next to Landmark. But the Landmarks, no, the stable side is where Landmark is, yeah. But that's a great big building.
Oh, okay.
That's condominiums now.
Okay.
And
Okay,
then-
so that's a condo next to where the stables used to be?
Yeah,
Okay.
there are, I don't know how many condominiums in there. It's on the corner of Thistle Street.
Okay. And then on the other side, on the water side, is the car station is,
Yeah, if you're driving and you look up the hill on the driveway,
yeah.
it's easier to see it if you're coming from Beverly to Beverly Farms. You'll see a brick building
Okay.
on the driveway
Okay.
that just looks like a mansion, a small mansion.
Oh, okay.
But it was the car house.
Okay. That sounds interesting.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Gail?
There were two things. There was a picture of a driveway that had a white building at the end of it. It's on Hale Street. And that was supposedly the home of the woman who played by Shirley MacLaine in the movie Mrs. Winterbourne. And there was also, if you go down Common Lane from Foster Street,
Yeah.
headed toward Pride's Crossing, on the left-hand side of the road, there's a curved wall, and on it says in a plaque, granite, the Shaw Estate. Do you know where I mean?
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
a 160 acre.
That was a huge,
property.
that was another Shaw.
And the house is
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
And somebody's gonna renovate it. was built in, it was an H.H. Richardson house. It was built, I want to say, in 1886 or 18.
Yeah. That's in the 1880s. Yeah.
And it still has the old gas. Light
Fixtures. Yeah. You can walk. Well, I've walked in around there. I don't know if anybody else has. Yeah, I know. Okay.
I will see it, yeah.
Next week is Amelia Earhart.
Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. So.